The fluorescent tube above the second chair had been flickering for 11 days. Mara Akafer knew this because she had been in this room 11 times in the last 2 weeks, and she had counted the flicker rate on the first day, roughly once every 4 seconds, and now she could not stop counting it, even while she was looking at the young man sitting across the table from her and trying to decide whether he was frightened or just young. He was 26. His name was Danny Lim. He was a patrol officer at the 6th District, Bridgeport, Ohio, and he had the kind of face that hadn't settled yet, the way faces don't until somewhere in the early 30s when life gets into the cartilage and hardens things. He had a small cut on his lower lip from where he'd bitten it. He'd been doing that since he sat down 40 minutes ago. "You said you noticed it during inventory rotation," Mara said. "Right. Walk me through that again." Danny exhaled through his nose. Not impatience, more like a man steadying himself before stepping off a ledge he'd been standing at the edge of for a long time. "It was a Thursday, second week of November. I was doing the inventory sweep in the secondary evidence room, the one off the loading dock, not the main cage. Sergeant Cutler was supposed to be supervising, but he got called to a traffic thing. So I'm going through the shelving unit on the east wall, checking tags against the log sheet, and I get to row 7, bag 4417, which is tagged as." He stopped, looked at his hands. "Cash seizure from a narcotics arrest. The 2019 Reese case." "And what did you see?" "The bag, it's a standard evidence bag, right? The red tamper evidence strip along the top. And the strip had been cut. Not along the seam where you'd open it, cut on the side, lengthwise, so somebody could slide a hand in and reach the contents without breaking the seal in the normal place. And then it had been retaped, with regular packing tape." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reading from a manual. She knew what that meant. It meant he'd been rehearsing it, running it over and over in his head until the words came out smooth and the emotion stayed somewhere underneath. "Did you look inside the bag?" "No, I didn't touch it. I logged the discrepancy in my personal notebook, not the official log sheet." "Why not the official sheet?" He didn't answer right away. The fluorescent tube blinked. "Because I didn't know who I was reporting it to," he said. She let that sit. Across the hall, someone's radio crackled with a dispatch code, 1050, a traffic accident, and then a voice acknowledged it and the sound died down to the building's usual underscore. The ventilation system's faint wheeze, the distant percussion of doors, the specific hollow acoustics of a government building that had been built cheap and not improved. "Did you tell anyone?" "My training officer, Sergeant Blau. I mentioned that I'd seen an irregularity in the secondary room. He said evidence bags get damaged, reseal all the time, and to note it in the log and move on." "And did you note it in the official log?" "I put packaging integrity check recommended in the inspection field, which is a standard notation. It doesn't flag anything automatically." And then 3 weeks later I heard someone in the break room mention the Reese habeas petition, that it was getting traction, and I went home and I pulled out my personal notebook." He stopped again. He had a way of stopping that wasn't hesitation so much as a kind of editorial pause, a place where he was deciding not what to say but how much of what he was feeling to let into the words. "I did some reading about the case, the discrepancy in the quantities. And I sat with that for about a week, and I didn't sleep great." "Did you talk to anyone else before coming to me?" "My wife?" He said it in a way that suggested the conversation had not been easy. "She said do what you think is right," which sounds simple, but she meant it, and she also understood what it might mean, and she said it anyway. Mara looked at him. He was looking at the table. "You could have stayed quiet," she said, not accusation, just a fact she was presenting, the way you present a fact to see how someone sits with it. "Yeah," he said, "I know." Bridgeport was the kind of city that showed up in newspaper features once every few years, usually in a paragraph that used the phrase post-industrial decline. It sat in the eastern pocket of Ohio, where the Allegheny foothills started to flatten, an hour south of Youngstown and 2 hours east of Columbus, close enough to Pittsburgh that on clear nights you could sometimes see a smear of orange on the horizon where its lights bled into the sky. The population had been dropping since 1978. There were 4 distinct neighborhoods that still had pulse: Federal Hill up by the old college, the flats along the river where the restaurants had moved in, a Korean enclave near the West Side Hospital, and the area everyone called the Commons, which had been called other things in other decades and would be called other things in the future, all of them meaning the same thing. The 6th District station sat on Weller Avenue, a squat two-story building in buff-colored brick that had been a county courthouse annex in the 1950s and still had the heavy wooden window casings and the brass door handles to prove it. The parking lot was too small and the evidence room was famously inadequate, a fact that appeared in the annual budget complaint that every captain in the last 15 years had submitted to City Council, and which City Council had noted and tabled and noted and tabled in an unbroken rhythm that had become its own kind of ceremony. Mara had been assigned to 6th District out of the county prosecutor's office in early October. She was not internal affairs. She needed that distinction kept clear in her own mind. She was a detective, Crimes Against Persons Unit 11 years in, and she had been asked quietly over lunch by a woman named Elaine Park who worked for the county and whose job title changed every time Mara asked, to look at the Calvin Reese habeas petition before it went federal. Look at it how, Mara had said. Look at it and tell me if the chain of custody problems are administrative or structural. What's the difference? Administrative, somebody made a paperwork mistake. Structural, somebody made a choice. Mara had driven home and sat at her kitchen table for an hour without eating the dinner she'd made. She had a bowl of lentil soup that went cold and then she ate it cold, standing up at the counter, and then she'd called Park back and said yes. Calvin Reese was 31 and had been incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Institution since March of 2020. Before that, he'd lived in the Commons with his mother and his younger sister, who was hearing impaired and attended Bridgeport Learning Center 3 mornings a week on a school district scholarship that Calvin had spent 2 years helping to apply for. He had worked at a distribution center on the east side 4th shift, unloading pallets, 70 hours some weeks. He had one prior, a possession charge from 2016 that had been pleaded down to a minor misdemeanor and carried no jail time. There were photographs in Fuentes's petition file, standard habeas exhibits, documentation of the defendant's life circumstances. Mara had seen thousands of these and typically moved through them quickly, establishing context without dwelling, but she found herself stopping on one. It was a photograph Fuentes had gotten from the family, Calvin and his sister, at some kind of cookout, both of them squinting into the sun, his arm around her shoulder, both of them in the middle of something that looked like laughing. It was not a posed photograph. It was the kind of photograph that exists in the phones of people who are not documenting their life so much as living it. She put the file back together and moved on. In September 2019, he had been arrested by officers from the 6th District Narcotics Unit following a traffic stop on Route 22. The officers, 2 patrolmen working under Lieutenant Dennis Farrell's division, reported finding 4.7 ounces of methamphetamine in the spare tire well of Reese's 2011 Civic. He was charged with possession with intent to distribute, a felony. His public defender, a 32-year-old named Jerome Tatum who was working 85 cases simultaneously, and had met Calvin Reese for a total of 40 minutes before the preliminary hearing, had advised him to take the plea. Calvin Reese had said he didn't have anything in that car. Tatum had nodded the way public defenders nodded when their clients said this, which was not unkindly, just with a particular exhaustion, and had walked him through the sentencing guidelines either way. Calvin had taken the plea, 4 years, eligible for parole at 2.5. He had not made parole because he'd gotten into a fight in the yard in the second month, a fight he had not started but had been unable to walk away from, and the fight had added 14 months to his minimum hold. Tatum had been replaced, caseload reassignment, by a woman named Rosalie Fuentes, who had taken one look at the evidence log and called the county prosecutor's office the following Monday morning. The log listed 4.7 ounces in the initial arrest report, but a supplemental intake form, the one filled out at the evidence room receiving window when the seized material was first logged in, listed 1.2 ounces. 4.7 was a felony, 1.2 was a misdemeanor. The difference was 3.5 years. Dennis Farrell was 52 years old and had the handshake of a man who believed handshakes communicated everything important about a person's character. He gripped it once, firmly, eye contact held just a beat past comfortable, then released. He'd been doing it for 24 years and it had gotten him through 8 performance reviews, 2 commendations, 1 internal affairs inquiry that went nowhere, and a marriage that was still technically intact though both parties would have struggled to explain why. He was not a large man, 5'11" maybe, and built the way men who used to be athletic in their 20s still carry themselves, upright, with a slight forward lean, like they're always just about to walk into a room with purpose. His hair had gone from dark brown to what his wife called distinguished and what he privately thought of as gray, and it was cut close on the sides in a way that was not quite military but suggested the memory of one. The particular thing about Farrell, the thing Mara would turn over later after everything, was that he was not cynical about the work. She had worked around cynical cops, around men who had gotten so saturated in the procedural grind that the people in the files had stopped being people and had become case numbers, unit statistics, outcomes to be managed. Farrell wasn't like that. He genuinely believed the work mattered, that his unit was doing something real in a city that had been hollowed out by things nobody in the department could arrest. She could see it in how people described his briefings, the specific attention he paid to his officers, the way he tracked individual arrests not just as numbers but as narratives, what worked, what didn't, who had made a good call under pressure. He was proud of the unit. Which was the thing that made the rest of it not simpler but more complicated, in the way that all human wrongdoing is complicated when it emerges from people who are not simply and uniformly bad. The narcotics division had been his for 8 years. Which in the life of a mid-sized department is a long time, long enough to become synonymous with the thing, to be the thing, so that officers talking about narcotics at 6th District weren't really talking about a unit so much as a man's particular interpretation of what the unit was for. Farrell had shaped it from a struggling, under-resourced 4-person operation into a 14-officer division with a drug seizure rate that the department cited in its annual report to City Council. The council liked the numbers. The council had liked them enough year after year to not look too closely at how they were produced. He ran the narcotics division with what his superiors described in evaluations as firm accountability. He had 14 officers under him, and the unit's seizure numbers had been among the best in the district for 6 of the last 8 years. He coached youth hockey on weekends in the fall, which people in the department knew and mentioned when his name came up in conversation, in the way people attach benign details to men whose other qualities they prefer not to examine too closely. Mara had seen him 3 times before she was formally introduced. Once in the hallway near the evidence room, walking with Cutler, talking low and fast with his eyes on the floor. Once in the parking lot, alone, sitting in his Tahoe with the engine running for 12 minutes before getting out. Once at the October birthday party for the records supervisor, where he'd spent the last 40 minutes of the evening working the room in a slow orbit, touching shoulders, laughing at things, getting names right, while Mara stood near the coffee urn and watched him calculate. When Captain Wick introduced them, Mara Ackhafer, she's with County, helping us on the Reese review, Farrell had smiled with all of the appropriate muscles and said it was nice to meet her and he'd be happy to answer any questions she had and that his door was genuinely open. Thank you, Mara had said. Hell of a thing this Reese business, he said. He shook his head the specific way men shake their heads when they want to appear troubled by something. When there are paperwork errors, it undermines everything we're trying to do out there. I want it sorted as much as anyone. I appreciate that, Mara said. He had held eye contact a beat too long after that, not aggressively, more like a man who had learned to do it as a tactic and had done it so many times it had become reflexive. Then someone called his name across the room and he excused himself smoothly and was gone. The evidence room at the 6th District had 3 components. The main cage, which was behind the receiving window and accessible only to evidence technicians and the evidence unit supervisor. The secondary storage room off the loading dock, which held older case material in numbered boxes on industrial shelving. And the cold storage locker, which was technically a repurposed walk-in refrigerator from the building's previous life as a county office, and which held biological evidence and certain pharmaceutical seizures. The main cage was logged electronically since 2015. The secondary room had been on an electronic log since 2018, when the county upgraded the system. Before 2018, the secondary room ran on handwritten sign-in sheets, which were supposed to be transcribed to digital records within 60 days, but which in practice were sometimes transcribed and sometimes boxed and sometimes neither. Mara pulled every access log for the secondary room going back 5 years. It took her 2 days to get them, because the request went through the district evidence supervisor, A woman named Terry Good who was thorough and slow and asked twice if Mara had the proper county authorization, and Mara had shown her the letter twice. And then Terry had gone to find a binder and Mara had stood at the counter and listened to the building, the dispatch radio from down the hall, the vending machine in the break room cycling its compressor, a phone ringing somewhere and stopping. What she found in the logs was not dramatic. It never was. Dramatic was what prosecutors built in courtrooms out of things that were in their raw form just numbers in columns and names in margins. What she found was this. Between January 2018 and the previous September, Lieutenant Dennis Farrell's keycard had accessed the secondary evidence room 47 times. The room handled older material. Narcotics cases went to the secondary room after 90 days. The secondary room was not Farrell's operational responsibility. He was not an evidence custodian. He had no role that required him to be in that room. His deputy, Sergeant Roy Cutler, had accessed the room 72 times in the same period. The district commander had accessed it 4 times. The evidence supervisor had accessed it 918 times, which was her job. She cross-referenced the access dates against the master case list. Farrell's visits were not random. They clustered unevenly but noticeably within 2 to 3 weeks of major narcotics seizures after the initial evidence had been moved from the main cage to secondary storage. The pattern was not airtight. There were visits that fell outside it, but the clustering was there, consistent enough that if you laid it out on a timeline, it started to look like something deliberate masquerading as administrative routine. She put the printed logs in a manila folder and took them home and sat with them under the kitchen light until the numbers stopped moving. Roy Cutler was not a complicated man in the way that Farrell was complicated. He was complicated in a more ordinary way, the way most people are complicated, which is that he had done what he thought he had to do and now he was living with it, and the living with it had become its own kind of second life that ran parallel to everything else. He had 2 daughters. He coached his younger daughter's soccer team. He had a brother in Cleveland he called every Sunday. He thought about the thing he'd been doing with Farrell roughly every 3 hours and had thought about it at that interval for about 4 years, which meant he had thought about it somewhere in the neighborhood of 14,000 times and had arrived at no resolution and had stopped expecting to. His role in it was not the part he'd expected to play when it started. He'd been in the room when Farrell first suggested it, a casual suggestion framed as a question, which was how Farrell did everything that mattered, and he'd said nothing, which Farrell had taken as agreement. And then he had been present on the second occasion, and the third, and somewhere in there it had passed the point where inaction was distinguishable from participation. The mechanics were not elaborate, which was part of why they had worked. Cash seizures from drug arrests were brought in sealed, logged at the receiving window, and moved to the main cage for 90 days while cases proceeded. During that period the material was under the evidence supervisor's control and effectively untouchable. But after disposition, when the case was resolved and the defendant had pled and the cash was waiting on a destruction order from the court, it moved to secondary storage. The destruction orders came slow. Some took 6 months, some took 2 years. The bureaucracy of evidence disposal was an afterthought to an underfunded department, which meant bags sat on shelves in the secondary room with nothing driving anyone to look at them urgently. Farrell had identified the gap. He had explained it to Cutler with the same clarity he brought to briefing room presentations, methodical step by step, a man who had thought a thing all the way through before he said it out loud. The destruction order doesn't specify exact weight, it references the case number. The case is already closed. The defendant has already pled to what the arrest report says. Nobody is going back to that shelf. He knew the difference between evidence rooms. Farrell had explained it once very clearly. The electronic log was clean. They didn't touch anything in the main cage. The secondary room, the older cases, the closed cases, the cases where the defendant had already pled and was already serving, the cases where nothing was going back to court, that was different. A bag of cash from a 2019 seizure sitting in secondary storage waiting for a destruction order that might take another 2 years to come through. Nobody was counting it. The case was closed. He had told himself that the things he had done were not really crimes. He had told himself this enough times that there were hours, sometimes whole afternoons, when he nearly believed it. Then the Reese petition had come through and Fuentes had started calling, and he had told himself something different. He had told himself to be very careful. Mara requested the original intake forms for all narcotics division seizures between March 2017 and October 2021. She did this through a formal records request to the district clerk, which meant it was timestamped and logged and visible to anyone who pulled the request queue. She knew this. She did it anyway because she had to, and because the alternative was to do it quietly through informal channels, and doing it quietly through informal channels was exactly the kind of thing you couldn't defend later. The request took 8 days. During those 8 days she went about her other work and she ate her meals and she ran her usual 3 miles in the morning even though it had gone cold in November and the sidewalks along the river were iced by 6 a.m. and she'd almost fallen twice. She had a daughter in Columbus, 21, studying nursing, and they talked on Sunday evenings. And during those calls Mara was aware of the partition that had formed over the years between who she was on the phone and who she was at work, and she had long ago stopped worrying about it the way she'd worried about it in her 30s. When the forms came back, she took them to the conference room with the flickering light and she spread them out chronologically and she went through them line by line over 3 days. She used a yellow legal pad, and a system she'd developed over 11 years, cross-referencing each field arrest report against its corresponding evidence intake form in a simple 2-column comparison. No color coding, no elaborate tracking spreadsheet, just 2 columns of numbers and a circle drawn around each discrepancy. By the end of the second day, the circles were a pattern. By the end of the third day, the pattern was a system. She found 9 discrepancies. In each case, the field arrest report listed a significantly higher quantity of controlled substances than the evidence room intake form. The differences ranged from less than an ounce to nearly 3 ounces. In 7 of the 9 cases, the defendant had taken a plea. In 2 cases, charges had been dropped and Mara could not immediately determine why. In all 9 cases, the arresting officers were from the 6th District Narcotics Division, working under Lieutenant Dennis Farrell. She sat with that fact. It had a particular weight, the fact that the scheme, if it was a scheme, and she was not yet prepared to call it anything more than a significant discrepancy pattern, had required something to go wrong in 2 distinct places simultaneously: the field where the quantities were written high and the evidence room where they came in low. The gap between the two was where the thing lived. The gap had been open long enough to become invisible. She thought about the intake process. The arresting officer didn't fill out the intake form. The evidence technician did based on what came through the receiving window, which meant someone at some point had been moving from the arresting officer's bag to the receiving window and losing ounces between the two. There were several ways that could happen. Some of them were innocent split transfers, sloppy packaging, weight error. Some were not. She organized the 9 cases by date, then by severity of discrepancy, then by outcome. She photographed every page with her phone and sent the photos to an encrypted folder on a county server that Elaine Park had set up for exactly this kind of thing. She sent Park a message that said only structural. Then she drove to the federal building on Center Street and sat in a waiting room for 50 minutes until Patricia Ways came out and took her back to a conference room that was identical to the one at the 6th District in almost every way except the fluorescent light didn't flicker. Patricia Ways was 44 and had been an assistant U.S. attorney for 11 years. She had the manner of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where most of the people were not telling the full truth and had made a kind of peace with it, not cynicism exactly but a practiced evenness, a refusal to be surprised. She wore glasses she didn't need for seeing and kept them pushed up on her head. She sat down across from Mara, slid the folder back across the table after 2 minutes and said, "How clean are these? The intake forms are originals, the arrest reports are certified copies from the district. Your chain of custody for these documents. Direct from district records, no intermediary." Ways put her glasses on and looked at one of the pages again. "We've had a bank account under review," she said. "Farrell's, joint with his wife, but the deposits are irregular in ways she doesn't explain." "How long?" 14 months. Mara thought about the 47 keycard entries. 14 months back from now put the start of Ways' investigation roughly 2 months before Danny Lim had noticed the retaped bag. She thought about that timing. She kept her face the way she kept it in rooms like this, still, not flat. "What do you need from me?" Mara said. "Can you get me a witness inside the building?" "Maybe." Not maybe, I need a yes or a no before I can move on Farrell, because if I move on him without someone inside and it falls apart. I understand. Do you have someone? Mara thought about Danny Lim's hands on the table, the cut on his lip, the notebook he'd kept, the way he'd said, because I didn't know who I was reporting it to. I might, she said. She met with Danny Lim twice before she asked him anything direct. The first time was in the same conference room, and she'd only wanted to hear his account and assess him. The second time was at a diner on Federal Hill off hours, and she'd bought him coffee and asked him about the job. He talked about it the way young officers talked when someone actually gave them room to carefully at first, and then with more motion to it, like a machine that'd been idling too long. He joined because he believed it meant something. He still believed it, he said, which he admitted sounded naive. She told him it didn't. On the third meeting, she told him what she'd found. She laid it out factually, without dramatics, the same way she'd have presented it to a lieutenant who needed to understand a situation quickly. He listened without interrupting, which not everyone did, and when she finished he sat back and pressed his thumb against the cut on his lip and looked at the wall. The bag, he said, 4417. Is one of 9 I've identified, probably not the last 9. How long has he been doing it? Long enough that it became invisible, she said. That's how these things work, they become part of the texture. What happens to me if You give a sworn statement to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your name goes into federal protective status. What happens to your career afterward is something I can't promise you because I'd be lying. He looked at her. She held his gaze not the way Farrell held it, not as technique, but because she owed him the straightforwardness. What's your best guess, he said. I think you go to a different district. I think some people treat you well and some don't, and eventually it sorts itself out. I've seen it go both ways, and I'd be dishonest if I told you it all goes one way. That's not very reassuring. No, she said. Danny Lim went home and didn't call her for 4 days. On the 5th day he texted, "I'll do it." She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment before she typed back, "Okay, tomorrow 9 a.m. Federal Building, ask for Waze." She sat down at her kitchen table and looked at the wall for a moment. The decision had been his. She had not engineered it, had not pressured it, had laid out the facts as clearly as she could, which was what she owed him. But she had also known after the second meeting that he was going to say yes. She had seen people at that particular decision point before, not many but a few, and there was a quality to them, a kind of careful steadiness, that meant the question was not if but when. It was not a comfortable thing to know about someone. It meant you had assessed them well enough to predict them, and that kind of knowing carried a responsibility to use it right. She thought about Farrell's daughter briefly, one of the two he'd mentioned. He'd showed her a photograph unprompted during the party conversation she'd been watching from near the coffee urn. A girl of maybe 15 in a hockey jersey, grinning. The specificity of it, the deliberateness of showing it, had struck her as a kind of argument. I am a man with daughters. Daughters are legible. Men with daughters you can understand. She put it out of her head and went to bed. Cutler found out about Danny Lim on a Wednesday, which Mara knew later because of timestamps on the surveillance footage from the 6th District parking lot, which showed Cutler's personal vehicle arriving at 11:43 p.m., nearly 5 hours after Cutler's shift had ended, and remaining in the lot for 22 minutes. What she didn't know until later was that Cutler had gone to the secondary evidence room that night. He'd used his keycard, another entry on the log, and he'd gone to the shelf where the bags from the Reese seizure sat, and he'd stood there and looked at bag 4417 for a while, and then he'd gone home. He testified later in his proffer session that he'd stood in that room for approximately 5 minutes. That the bag had been on the shelf with its retaped side visible, the packing tape dull under the fluorescent light, and he had stood there and looked at it and thought about a number of things and had not touched it. He had thought about his younger daughter, who was 11 and who had recently started asking difficult questions about his job. Not difficult because they were hostile, but difficult because they were sincere, the way a child's questions are sincere before the world teaches them the social cost of sincerity. She'd asked him once whether anyone he arrested was actually innocent. He had said, "Not that I know of, sweetheart." She had accepted this. He had thought about that answer for a long time after. He had not removed the bag, he had not tampered with it further. Whatever he had gone there to do, he had not done it, and when Mara thought about that later, she thought it said something about the edge he was standing at. Farrell, by contrast, did nothing outwardly different at all. He showed up the next morning, ran his 8 a.m. briefing with his division, sent 2 emails about patrol scheduling, and ate his lunch at his desk. He played hockey practice on Saturday. He called his wife from the car on the way home. He was not panicking because men like Farrell did not panic. What they did instead was calculate, and the calculation was not visible from outside. It just happened somewhere behind the presentation of normalcy, grinding along. He came to see Mara on Thursday. He knocked on the conference room door and opened it without waiting, which told her he'd scouted when the room was empty. He sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table. "Hear you're wrapping up soon," he said. "Where'd you hear that?" "People talk," he smiled. It was the smile from the party, full facial deployment, nothing behind it. "Wanted to see if there's anything I could help with before you write up your findings." "I'm still in the middle of it." Sure, I just the Reese case, I've looked back at it and I think what you're going to find is a documentation error in the booking process." Officer Hendricks, who filled out the intake form, he had a notation issue he was corrected on. "I can pull that if it'd be useful." "You can send it to the county records request," Mara said. "That's the formal channel." The smile didn't leave his face, but the warmth went out of it like a pilot light going down. "Okay," he said. "Sure." He stood up, adjusting his jacket. "You have kids?" "Excuse me. I was just going to say, a lot of people in this building have kids. I have 2. Cutler's got 2. You have a daughter, right, Columbus?" He said it gently. He was not threatening her, not in any way that could be cited. He was just nodding that he knew things. It's a hard job. Sometimes you put years into it and the political side catches you off guard. He moved toward the door. "But you seem like someone who knows how to navigate." She let him get almost to the door. "Lieutenant," she said. He turned. "I'll be here through the end of next week," she said. "You need anything, just knock." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded and left. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed slowly through her nose. Her heart rate was elevated. She noted it the way she noted the flicker in the fluorescent light factually, without letting it mean anything more than it meant. Patricia Ways served the federal subpoena on a Friday morning. It was early, just past 7, and the parking lot was thin. 4 vehicles from the federal task force, 2 unmarked, 2 with the blue and white federal plates. Mara was not there for the service. Her role was done formally, and she'd been told by both Ways and Park to stay out of it, which she did. She was in her car on Weller Avenue, 3 blocks north, listening to the radio. A dispatch call came through about a fender bender on the 22 connector. Then the weather. She turned it off. She had not slept well. Not because she was anxious about what was happening, she had been in enough of these to know they went the way they went, incrementally, without fanfare, but because there was something about the proximity of this one that she hadn't fully metabolized. This was a police station. The person being served was a police officer. The people executing the warrant were law enforcement. The whole thing had a recursive quality that she didn't find troubling exactly, but that she found difficult to set aside, the way you can't set aside a sound you can't identify. What she learned about the morning came from Danny Lim later, and from the incident log, and from a deposition that was eventually made part of the federal record. The task force came through the main entrance and the side entrance simultaneously. Ways had been granted a search warrant for Farrell's office and personal locker, a subpoena for all physical records pertaining to 43 narcotics cases identified in the federal complaint, and an arrest warrant for Farrell on 4 counts: evidence tampering, theft of government property, obstruction of justice, and filing a false instrument. The charges did not include whatever additional charges might follow when the 9 cases were fully reviewed. They did not include the possibility, still only a hypothesis, needing more, that the cash seized and the cash logged had not always matched, and that the difference had moved somewhere. 2 of Farrell's division officers were at their desks when the task force came through the narcotics wing. One of them, a woman named Chen who had 6 years under Farrell and was not, as far as anyone could establish, part of what had been happening, looked up and made eye contact with the lead federal agent, and held very still in the way people hold still when they have a sudden instinct that movement will be interpreted badly. The other officer was not in the room. He was in the break room getting coffee and he heard the footsteps in the corridor and came out into the hallway and stopped when he saw the vests and the document folders and walked calmly back into the break room and stood at the counter and didn't get his coffee. Farrell was at his desk when they came in. Captain Wick had been notified 2 minutes prior, which was procedurally required, and was sufficient to tell Wick what was happening without giving Farrell time to do anything about it. Farrell looked up from his computer when the 2 federal agents came through his office door. He did not stand up. He asked to see the warrant, and one of the agents held it out, and he read it with the care of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and found it. He stood up then, he said, "I want my attorney." The agent said, "Sure." Farrell looked toward the door. Cutler was in the hall. He had come from his own office when he heard the sound of the entry team in the corridor, not a dramatic sound, just the extra footsteps, the purposeful movement, and he was standing in the hallway looking at the agents and at Farrell's open door with an expression that Wick later described as resigned. Like a man watching a bus, he decided not to board, finally pull away from the stop. Farrell did not speak to Cutler. He looked at him for 2 or 3 seconds, and whatever calculation was running behind his eyes resolved into nothing Cutler could read, and then Farrell looked away. In the secondary evidence room, 3 evidence technicians from the federal task force were working their way through row 7 of the east wall shelving. One of them found bag 4417 and photographed it and photographed the packing tape on the side and bagged the bag in a larger evidence envelope and tagged it. The process took 6 minutes. They worked without speaking except for the occasional procedural exchange: bag sealed, tag confirmed, photograph taken, the kind of language that sounded almost liturgical in a silent room, the language of people converting disorder into record. Out in the building's common area, the patrol shift had started to arrive for the 7:30 briefing, and was standing around in small clusters looking at the activity with the specific stillness of people who have learned not to ask questions in certain circumstances. Danny Lim was among them. He watched the agents move through the corridor and did not say anything. The officer next to him, a woman named Gretchen Cole who was 2 years his senior, leaned close and said, "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," Danny said. He did know. The knowing was a physical thing in his chest, not entirely pleasant, somewhere between relief and the beginning of something that had not resolved into any one feeling yet. Roy Cutler gave his interview to federal investigators 7 days after Farrell's arrest. He had retained an attorney, a woman from Youngstown named Diane Park, no relation to Elaine, who had negotiated a proffer agreement before he said a single word. The proffer meant he could speak without the statements being directly used against him, in exchange for full and honest cooperation and a forthcoming guilty plea to a reduced count. He sat in the federal building in the same style of conference room, long table, fluorescent light, water pitcher nobody ever touched, and he talked for 4 hours. He confirmed what the evidence and the documents had already outlined. He described the mechanics of what they'd been doing, Farrell's system, the timing, the specific cases, which bags in which rows, the rough accounting of how much over how many years. He could not give an exact figure. He estimated it conservatively, and the estimate was significant. The IRS agent in the room made a note. He talked about the weight discrepancies on the drug seizures. That had been Farrell's initiative. Farrell had explained the rationale once: the numbers needed to reflect the reality of what the unit was dealing with. The unit's budget was tied to its seizure statistics. The city was cutting, and if the numbers looked small, the unit would be cut and the work they were doing, the real work, the work that mattered, Farrell had said. In the particular way he used the phrase, the work that matters, as a kind of talisman, would stop. "Did you believe that?" the federal agent asked. Cutler looked at his hands. He had the broad, flat hands of a man who worked outdoors, though he had not worked outdoors in many years. "I don't know what I believed," he said. "I think I believed he believed it." "But you kept doing it." "Yes. Because." He was quiet for a long time. His attorney did not interject. The agent waited. "Because by the time I was thinking clearly about it," Cutler said, "I was already in it." The Farrell interrogation took place on a Tuesday, 12 days after the arrest. He had been released on bond, his attorney had made the standard motions, and now they were all in a room together: Ways, a second AUSA named Hargrove, a federal agent named Beltran, and Farrell's attorney, a man in a very good suit named Delacroix. Farrell had not changed much in 12 days. He looked like a man who had decided what posture to adopt and had adopted it, measured, steady, attentive, not defensive. He answered questions with the particular precision of someone who had been prepared and was executing the preparation. Yes, he had accessed the secondary evidence room. That was not unusual. He had administrative oversight responsibilities. The frequency of access over 4 years, had he a record of those visits? His attorney noted that the electronic access logs spoke for themselves. Did he have any explanation for the discrepancy between the field reports and the evidence intake forms in the 9 cases identified in the complaint? He had reviewed the relevant cases and he believed the discrepancies reflected errors in field documentation, for which he had already submitted a corrective memo in 2021, which his attorney would provide. Mara was not in the room. She was watching through the one-way glass with Elaine Park, who had not said a word since they'd come in. Farrell sat with his forearms on the table, hands loosely folded, posture open, and Mara watched him navigate the questions with a competence that was almost impressive. He had spent 24 years in rooms like this, just on the other side of the table. He knew the architecture of interrogation the way a locksmith knows locks, not just how to pick them but how they were built, where the tolerance was, where you could apply pressure and where you had to go gently. "Mr. Farrell," Waze said, and she paused long enough that the pause had weight. She slid a photograph across the table. It was bag 4417, photographed in situ, the packing tape visible on the side. "Can you tell me when the last time was that you accessed this specific item in evidence storage?" Farrell looked at the photograph. His attorney put a hand on his arm, a slight touch, a signal, and Farrell said, "On advice of counsel, I'll be declining to answer that question." "Okay," Waze said. She put the photograph back in its folder. "Let me ask you about the Simmons seizure from April 2019. She slid another document. "The field report shows $2,000 and change, the intake shows $940. I believe that discrepancy is addressed in the corrective memo." "The memo addresses the documentation process generally. Can you address this specific case specifically?" "I cannot speak to individual cases without more time to review." Waze nodded. She looked at her legal pad. She uncapped her pen and then didn't write anything, just let it rest there. Farrell watched the pen. "Sergeant Cutler has been speaking with us," she said. Nothing happened in Farrell's face for a moment. The skin around his eyes did not move. His jaw did not shift. He blinked at the normal rate. Then something settled in him, some small adjustment, like a building shifting half an inch in a wind, and he looked down at his hands and then back up. "I'll need to confer with my attorney," he said. "Of course," Waze said. They broke for 22 minutes. When they came back, Farrell's posture was the same, but the competence had gone out of it. It looked like a thing he was wearing now, not a thing he was. He still didn't confess. Not that day, not in that room. Men like Farrell don't confess in interrogation rooms. They confess in plea negotiations, in writing, in the specific language of the federal court process, stripped of all the performance that had sustained them. That came later. The federal indictment came down in February, 8 months after Mara had walked into the 6th District and stood at Terry Good's counter waiting for access logs. The indictment covered Farrell on 11 counts, expanded from the original 4 to include mail fraud, wire fraud, and 2 counts of conspiracy. Cutler was charged separately on 4 counts and entered his guilty plea the same week. 3 of the 9 cases identified in Mara's initial review were reopened. Calvin Reese's was among them. His sentence was vacated in a brief proceeding that took 20 minutes, during which he sat at the defense table in street clothes. His sister had brought him a button-down shirt, and listened to a federal judge read the order in the flat, procedural language the federal court used for everything. When it was done, his attorney shook his hand and his sister was crying somewhere in the gallery behind him, and Calvin Reese looked straight ahead for a long moment before he stood up. He did not look particularly like a man who had been freed. He looked like a man coming to terms with an accounting that would take years to balance. His attorney filed a civil suit against the city the following week. The Bridgeport Courier-Tribune ran the story across 4 days, the first piece on the day of the indictment, The following three pieces going deeper into the specific cases and the department's internal culture and the budget pressures that Farrell's attorney would eventually argue in federal court had contributed to the conditions that made the scheme possible. That argument was not entirely unconvincing, and not entirely wrong, and it also was not a defense. The piece on the third day focused on Calvin Reese. Jerome Tatum, his original public defender, declined to comment. Rosalie Fuentes, his appellate counsel, gave a brief statement about the chain of custody irregularities and the importance of evidence integrity. Calvin Reese himself did not speak to the paper, and the paper noted this with some restrained disappointment in the way papers do when the subject they expect to speak doesn't, framing the silence as something the reader should interpret rather than making the interpretation for them. On the fourth day, the paper ran a piece about the department's evidence management practices and the history of budget complaints and the city council's repeated failure to fund the evidence room upgrade that 3 successive captains had requested. The piece was careful and reasonably accurate, and nobody in city government responded to it on the record, which also became part of the record. A television crew from Columbus came and stood outside the 6th District for 2 days and interviewed people on their way in. Captain Wicks said what captains say in these situations, that the behavior was not representative, that the department was committed to accountability, that reforms were underway. He said it with the particular fatigue of a man who had had to say it and meant it and knew that meaning it was not sufficient. 2 of Farrell's division officers were placed on administrative review while the federal investigation examined whether additional personnel had been aware of the scheme. Neither was charged. One returned to active duty 6 months later, the other resigned, citing unrelated personal reasons. The city council convened a special session. There was discussion of an independent oversight board. There had been discussion of an independent oversight board in 2009, and in 2015, and nothing had been established either time, for the usual reasons. This time the discussion lasted longer and a subcommittee was formed, and the subcommittee met 3 times over the following 8 months, and produced a preliminary framework that was forwarded to the full council for consideration. The council noted it and tabled it, then they noted it again. Elaine Park's office issued a report. The report was 74 pages and its recommendations section ran to 17 bullet points, 3 of which were subsequently adopted by the department in modified form. The modified versions were less specific than the original recommendations and more deferential to departmental discretion, which was standard. Mara was listed in the acknowledgments. Her name appeared between the names of 2 county paralegals and the evidence supervisor, Terry Good, who had pulled the access logs with characteristic thoroughness and whose contribution Mara thought deserved more than a line in the acknowledgments, but she didn't control the acknowledgments section of other people's reports. Mara drove out to Chillicothe on the day Calvin Reese was released, though she didn't go inside. She sat in the parking lot of a gas station off Route 35 and looked at the facility's concrete perimeter and thought about the 3 years he had been inside there. She thought about the 12 months added to his hold for a fight he hadn't started. She thought about the 47 keycard entries and the 9 discrepancies and the single unbroken logic that had connected them all to the moment a man in a button-down shirt stood up in a courtroom. She thought about Farrell's handshake. The one grip, the eye contact held a beat too long. She'd had 100 versions of that handshake from 100 versions of that man over 11 years. The grip as message, as signal, as the small assertion of hierarchy that men who needed hierarchy made automatically. The way they breathed. Farrell had done it well, which was why it had worked for so long. He'd been so fluent in the language of authority that nobody had paused to examine what the authority was built on. She wasn't sure why she'd driven out. She couldn't do anything from the parking lot that she hadn't already done from the conference room on Weller Avenue. She wasn't the kind of person who needed to witness things to make them real. She'd been doing this long enough that she trusted the paperwork. Evidence was evidence, it didn't require presence. And yet, she saw a man come through the facility's pedestrian exit and stop on the sidewalk outside. He was carrying a plastic bag and wearing a button-down shirt, and a woman was there, waiting, young, slight, and when she waved her hands it took Mara a moment to understand she was signing. He signed back, and then she covered her mouth with both hands, and then they were holding each other in the way people hold each other when they have been rehearsing the moment in their heads for so long that the actual moment almost doesn't feel real, and you hold on partly to feel it, and partly to stop it from becoming memory too fast. Mara sat in the parking lot for a while, then she pulled back onto the highway and drove north. Dennis Farrell entered a guilty plea in April, 13 months after the investigation formally began. He pleaded to 3 counts: evidence tampering, theft of government property, and obstruction of justice, in exchange for the remaining 8 counts being dropped. The plea agreement was 14 pages. His attorney had negotiated it over 6 weeks. The sentencing recommendation was 4 to 6 years, with eligibility for early release at 32 months. He stood at the defense table and said yes, he understood the charges. He said yes, the facts in the plea agreement were substantially accurate. He said yes, he was entering the plea voluntarily. The judge accepted the plea and set sentencing for 90 days out. During the plea colloquy, when the judge had asked Farrell to state in his own words what he had done, there had been a pause of several seconds, long enough that the clerk had looked up. Farrell had looked at the space in front of him, some middle distance, and then he had said in a measured and flat voice that he had removed cash from evidence storage on multiple occasions, that he had made false entries in official documentation, and that he had taken actions to obstruct the lawful investigation of those activities. He had said it the way you recite a passage you've memorized, with the right words in the right order and nothing carried in the sound of them. The judge had asked if he wanted to add anything. Farrell had said no. Farrell's wife was in the gallery. She had been at every hearing. She was a woman in her early 50s with careful posture and a face that had learned to give away very little over the years, and Mara, who was in the back row of the gallery, watched her and could not tell what was happening behind it. She had her hands in her lap, folded, and she was looking at the back of Farrell's head with an expression that was neither love nor the absence of it, but something that had been both things at different times and was now neither. After the hearing in the corridor, Delacroix was speaking with Way's co-counsel about sentencing logistics, and Farrell was standing slightly apart, his suit jacket over one arm, looking at the marble floor of the federal courthouse. He looked like a man in a long pause, waiting for a word he couldn't produce. Mara was 30 feet away and had no reason to approach him and did not. She watched him stand there. He was, she knew, working through the next phase of the calculation: how to be this, how to carry it, how to construct the story of himself that would survive the reduction of everything else. He would find a version. Men like him generally did. The version would not be dishonest exactly, just incomplete, strategic in its emphases, which was different from lying in a way that would eventually satisfy him. His wife took his arm. They walked toward the elevator. The doors closed. Ways appeared beside Mara in the corridor. They stood for a moment without speaking. Then Ways said, "Cutler's sentencing is March 3rd. She tucked a folder under her arm. "He'll probably get 18 months. "Probably," Mara agreed. "The civil suit against the city is going to run for 2 years at least." "I know." The 3 reopened cases. Reese gets out. The Simmons case is probably getting vacated too. The 3rd one's complicated. She already served her time. The damages litigation on that one is going to be Ways, Mara said. Ways stopped. "I know," Mara said, not unkindly. Ways looked at her. Then she nodded and they walked in the same direction toward the exit, not together exactly, but in parallel, in the particular way of people who have worked the same problem from different angles and found themselves, at the end, in the same corridor at the same time, heading for the same door. Danny Lim was transferred to the 3rd District in March. The transfer was officially a lateral reassignment, routine restructuring, and anyone who asked was told this, and most people who asked understood what it meant. He had been assigned to a new training officer and was working a different patrol sector. Mara had his number. She texted him once, 2 weeks after the indictment, to ask how he was doing. He'd written back, "Okay, weird, good weird, I think." She'd typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "That sounds about right." There was eventually a morning when Mara sat in the conference room at the county building and filed the last paperwork from the Reese review. It was February, the sky the color of old tin snow coming. She aligned the pages in a stack, clipped them, placed them in a folder. She had done this 100 times for other cases, organized, filed, moved on. This time she sat for a moment with the folder in her hands. She thought about Calvin Reese's sister in the gallery, her hands over her mouth. She thought about the notebook Danny Lim had kept in his personal pocket instead of the official log sheet. She thought about the way Cutler had stood in the hall watching the agents move through the corridor with that expression Wick had described as resigned. She thought about Terry Good asking twice if Mara had proper county authorization and waiting for the binder with an unhurriedness that had seemed bureaucratic at the time and seemed, in retrospect, like something closer to integrity. She thought about the 47 keycard entries, each one a small decision made in the dark of a secondary evidence room by a man who had told himself the story of himself so many times the story had replaced everything else. She put the folder in the outbox and went to get coffee and came back and opened the next file. Outside, the snow started. It fell without urgency, the way it fell in Ohio in February, steady, undramatic, covering the parking lot and the buff-colored bricks of the old courthouse annex on Weller Avenue and the streets of the Commons where Calvin Reese was at that moment, or would be in some version of the days ahead, learning to live in the city again, the way people did, slowly, without ceremony, one ordinary hour at a time. On shelf 7 of the secondary evidence room, now empty, the fluorescent light ran without flickering. Nobody was counting anything. The room was quiet and its inventory was current and all the bags were sealed.